So we get to finally talk about another iPhone that I'm in love with, and it's easily one of my favorite iPhones of all time. And even now to this day, it is still an iPhone I would recommend you to buy. I think it's one of the best priced iPhones out there. It has a ton of capability, a ton of power, and it still feels like a flagship. And anytime I pick it up, it's such a beautiful phone, and I would honestly marry it if I had the choice. Now, this specific iPhone is called the iPhone 11 Pro. Now, this was a 2019 flagship. It wasn't the most expensive one of that year, but it was a very good iPhone, and even to this day it still holds up completely well. Now, this phone has gone down in value quite a bit, so if you want to buy this iPhone or some other iPhones I'd recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, the body of this iPhone is one of my favorite things about this iPhone still. Now, it did come at a little bit of a smaller 5.8-inch Super Retina XDR OLED panel. There's no 120Hz, but it's still a very smooth looking display. It has the notch, but every other iPhone has it now. And when I look at this panel and I look at like the iPhone 13 Pro panel, there are definitely a lot of differences, but there's a lot of similarity. And honestly, when I use my 11 Pro, like even when I shot the B-roll of this video that you're looking at, I couldn't even tell. Like, I kind of forgot about it, to be honest, that it doesn't have ProMotion. It's still a very good looking panel, and I'm a humongous fan with the way this phone looks for sure. Now, we do have the lightning port at the bottom, which is great. We have speakers, everything like that, obviously. On the back though, this is the more interesting thing. We have a frosted glass back on this phone, which in my opinion is one of my favorite things about the newer iPhones, and it actually originated with this iPhone. The 11 Pro was the first iPhone to bring that type of feature, and again, this is one of my favorite things about this device for sure. We have wireless charging, we have IP certification, we have a triple camera setup. I mean, this phone pretty much has it all, and if you still have an 11 Pro, I would highly recommend keeping it. Even if you don't have an 11 Pro, if you have something like an iPhone 10 or an iPhone 6S or iPhone 8, going up to an 11 Pro is a great way of saving a bunch of money and still feeling like you have a pretty good flagship for sure. So in terms of the outside, that pretty much covers it up for the most part. Now, I do want to hit on the cameras because this is still a very fascinating thing. The iPhone 11 Pro on the back has that triple camera setup. So it has a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, a 12 megapixel telephoto lens, then another 12 megapixel ultra wide sensor, and on the front it has a 12 megapixel wide angle lens. Now, you can do 4K at 60 videos on both the front and the back of this phone, and this is why this phone is so important in my opinion. This phone is pretty much future proofed. Until Apple puts 8K on the front and the back, this phone's quality in terms of resolution and everything is obviously going to be pretty good still. The only thing that it's even lacking is the LiDAR sensor and, some pro video resolutions that we can film in on the newer iPhone, and quite potentially cinematic mode. But even me, with someone like an iPhone 13 Pro in my use case, I never use any of the Pro features. I don't use Pro RAW or Pro Res, and I don't even use cinematic mode on my iPhone 13 Pro. So this phone has everything I still need on a device. The photos it takes are beautiful, the videos it takes is still very beautiful, and I more recently did a camera comparison between the iPhone 13 Pro and iPhone 11 Pro, and for the most part, the photo qualities are fairly similar. The 13s and 13 Pros are better, but you're not going to be comparing them every single time. So definitely I would say the iPhone 11 Pro's camera is still very good and has a lot of capability for sure. And if you're somebody who needs to go and pick up, some type of camera that can still do the job, this is for sure a very solid camera without a doubt, and I would still highly recommend you guys to pick it up for sure. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now, hitting on the software of this phone, this device is still going to be lasting for quite a long time. Like I mentioned, this phone came out in 2019, and that was just a couple of years ago. That wasn't that long ago. And because of that, this phone has a very long future ahead of it. It's not going to be outdated like tomorrow or anything. So even if you pick up this phone next year or the year after, you are still getting several years of software updates. And this is my favorite thing, or one of my favorite things about this phone, is because it's a cheaper value than the newest iPhones, but it doesn't feel like you're missing out on anything. This phone is getting the same day updates as something like an iPhone 13 Pro. So even though it's a couple years older, you're still going to be getting the same updates for the next couple of years. It's probably not going to last maybe like 2 years less than the iPhone 13 Pro, but it's still a very good phone in terms of software, and I have had very few complaints. Every so often, I still use this phone on my second channel, and I really don't have that much to complain about at all. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up in terms of software. Now, hitting on the performance, this is another pretty big asset for this type of iPhone. It has that Apple A13 Bionic chip inside of it with 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, when I used this phone for a full year, actually over a year, from 2019 to about 2020 in October, I had nothing to complain about. This was a very good performing phone. Anything I ever needed to do for my device, this thing was able to handle it. I edited a bunch of video and audio on this phone constantly. I would be opening up apps, doing apps like LumaFusion and iMovie and different applications like that. And this phone was a beast. It would be able to handle everything I threw at it. And that was on iOS 13. I then updated to iOS 14, and this phone was more or less the same. It actually handled pretty much everything I threw at it there too. So really anything I was doing on this phone, and anything I did from like 2019 to 2020 on this channel, was being used by this phone, which was amazing. I had a great experience with it. And even now on iOS 15, this device still sits in a very interesting spot. It's not the craziest best performing phone, but I don't think that has a lot to do with the iPhone 11 Pro's hardware. I think that has a lot to do with iOS 15. I think there's been a lot of situations recently where some of these phones will just randomly not perform as well on iOS 15. I noticed even my iPhone 13 has some issues with RAM management, but the 11 Pro's performance is still very good when you consider the age and the price of this phone. If I were you, and if I had an older iPhone like an iPhone 6s or an iPhone 7, even an iPhone 10 or 10R, an iPhone 11 Pro's performance is still top tier. And as I mentioned before, I've had very few things to complain about this phone. So even for basic tasks, it's amazing, but even for heavier intensive apps like, video editing, or if you're playing super intensive video games or something like that on these iPhones, you're not going to be having a bad experience. And that's just honestly the truth. After comparing this iPhone against all the other iPhones, this has been a very good performing device. And this is why I still love this phone for sure. It has a ton of capability. It's still going to last for a very long amount of time. And if you're in the market, I would highly recommend picking it up just because of the performance and the build quality for sure. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now ending it off with the battery life, this device had a 3046 mAh battery inside of it. And basically that goes to say that this phone's performance in the battery segment is still pretty good for the most part. Now from 2019 to 2020 of me using this phone, it was perfect. I would not even kill this thing in one day. This thing could last me like 2 days easily, and that was another big advantage for this device. Now, somewhat of a disadvantage nowadays is that iOS 15 has kind of taken somewhat of a toll on this phone. It's not a big deal like I mentioned, but it is another thing to keep in mind. If I were you and if I needed to buy a phone that had the best type of battery, well, it would probably be best to wait it out until iOS 15 gets a little bit better. On iOS 14, my 11 Pro was actually pretty good. Now on iOS 15 is taking a toll like I mentioned, but I think it's going to get fixed throughout time, and I wouldn't even worry about it too much longer beyond that. So in terms of that covers it up there. And to be completely honest, the iPhone 11 Pro, in my opinion, is still a very solid phone to pick up. I think it has so much capability, has a ton of quality within it, and I don't really think it's, a crazy big deal if you still have this phone. I mean, if I were you, if I didn't have this channel, I would still be using an iPhone 11 Pro without a doubt. It has so much capability, has so much quality, and this is that type of phone where you could just go and buy and pretty much move on with your life. You don't have to worry about the craziest, biggest flagship features that the iPhone 13 Pro has. It would be nice to get a 13 Pro, but other than that, I think this phone is so beautiful. It has so much capability, and I wouldn't worry about upgrading if you do have this phone. But if you do have an older phone, like an iPhone 10 or something, going to an 11 Pro is a great middle ground. I think that phone has a lot of capability still, and I would highly recommend picking it up for sure. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.